In the year 354, a Roman bureaucrat compiled a calendar. It was an administrative document, not a political statement. He was just writing down which days the government offices would be closed. And when you add up the entries, the number is 177. 177 days per year dedicated to public games, chariot races, gladiatorial combat, theatrical performances, religious festivals that had long since stopped being religious and become pure spectacle. The Roman government had, by the 4th century, designated nearly half the calendar year as entertainment. That number on its own is interesting. What makes it disturbing is what was happening simultaneously. The currency had been debased from 95% silver under Augustus to 2% silver by the reign of Claudius II. The empire had cycled through 26 emperors in 50 years during the crisis of the 3rd century. The legions were increasingly staffed by mercenaries who felt no loyalty to Rome. The infrastructure, the roads and aqueducts that had made the empire possible, was deteriorating faster than it could be repaired, and the response of the state was not to fix any of this. The response was to add more game days to the calendar. I have spent an unreasonable amount of time with this subject over the past several months, and what I found goes well beyond Rome. There is a pattern in the historical record that has been documented by at least 6 major scholars across the last century, published in academic presses, taught in universities, and almost never discussed in public. The pattern is this. Every civilization that has undergone structural collapse in the last 2,500 years produced a golden age of entertainment in the decades immediately preceding that collapse. Not some of them. Every single one that we have sufficient records to examine. And the modern world is not approaching this pattern. It is already deeper inside it than any previous civilization at any point in recorded history. That is not speculation. That is what the data says. And the fact that you have almost certainly never heard it framed this way should, by itself, tell you something. The question that will drive everything you are about to hear is not whether this pattern exists. The evidence for its existence is overwhelming. The question is what entertainment is actually doing inside a dying civilization, whether it is a symptom, an accelerant, or something stranger than either, and whether we would be able to recognize the pattern if we were living inside it. I want to start with Rome because the data is the most complete, but I need you to understand that Rome is not the point of this story. Rome is the calibration. It is the baseline that will make everything that comes after it land harder. In the early Roman Republic, public games occupied a handful of days each September. The Ludi Romani, the oldest festival, ran for about 4 days. By 100 BC, 6 established festivals consumed 49 days per year. Augustus standardized the calendar at 77 game days. Under Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180, the number hit 135. And then it kept climbing until you reached that calendar from 354, compiled during the reign of Constantius II, where 177 days are blocked off for public spectacle, 66 of them specifically for chariot races at the Circus Maximus, which seated 250,000 people. Think about that ratio for a second. 250,000 Romans could attend a single venue on any given race day, in a city of roughly 1 million. The scale of individual events escalated in parallel. When the Colosseum opened in 80 AD under the Emperor Titus, the inaugural games ran for 100 consecutive days. Cassius Dio, who was a senator and an eyewitness to much of what he recorded, tells us that over 9,000 animals were killed and roughly 2,000 people died during those games. Augustus, in his own autobiography, the Res Gestae, which was literally carved into bronze tablets and displayed across the empire, bragged about staging 26 animal hunts that killed 3,500 African animals, 8 gladiatorial shows involving around 10,000 fighters, and a full naval battle with 30 warships and 3,000 combatants in an artificial lake he had dug specifically for the occasion. Trajan's victory games after the Dacian Wars ran for 123 straight days and deployed 11,000 animals and 10,000 gladiators. And then you get to Commodus. I personally think Commodus is the most underrated figure in this entire story, because he is not just an emperor who liked gladiatorial games. He is the pattern made flesh. He ruled from 180 to 192, which is exactly the period when Rome tipped from the stability of the 5 good emperors into the chaos that would define the next century. And he fought in the arena himself. The Historia Augusta claims 735 times. Cassius Dio, the senator, was in the stands and describes watching the emperor kill 100 bears in a single day from a raised platform, then decapitate a running ostrich with a specially designed crescent-shaped blade, then carry the bleeding head to the senatorial seats and gesture at the senators with his sword while grinning. Dio writes that the senators chewed laurel leaves to keep from laughing out of sheer terror. On December 31st, 192, Commodus was strangled in his bath by his wrestling partner Narcissus, hours before he planned to inaugurate the new year by appearing as both consul and gladiator simultaneously. But here is where it starts to get worse, because the entertainment calendar was not funded by magic. It was funded by the same treasury that was supposed to maintain the legions, the roads, the aqueducts, and the grain supply. The grain dole alone, the annona, fed roughly 200,000 recipients with about 33 kilograms of wheat per person per month, requiring Rome to import approximately 300,000 metric tons of grain annually. When Septimius Severus took power in 1993, he converted the grain ration to baked bread and added olive oil. Aurelian added wine and pork in the 270s. By the 4th century, Rome maintained 290 granaries and 254 bakeries just to keep the dole running. And while all of this was expanding, the money was collapsing. The denarius went from 95% silver under Augustus to 82% under Nero, to 75% under Marcus Aurelius, to 50% under Septimius Severus. Then Caracalla introduced the Antoninianus in 215, at double denomination but only 1.5 times the silver weight, which is just inflation with a new name. By 269, the Antoninianus contained 2% silver. Diocletian tried to fix it with the edict on maximum prices in 301. It failed. The military, meanwhile, was following the exact same curve downward. Emperor Decius became the first Roman emperor killed fighting foreign enemies at the Battle of Abritus in 251. Emperor Valerian was captured alive by the Sassanid king Shapur I in 260, an event so unprecedented that Shapur allegedly used him as a human footstool to mount his horse. During the crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284, 26 emperors ruled in 50 years. In 238 alone, 6 different men claimed the throne. And the ecological damage from the games was permanent and measurable. Hippos disappeared from the Nile. Lions were driven extinct in Mesopotamia. North African elephants vanished entirely, hunted to feed the arena's appetite for spectacle. Gladiatorial combat was finally banned in 404 AD after a monk named Telemachus leapt into the arena to stop a fight and was stoned to death by the enraged crowd, prompting Emperor Honorius to end the practice. The Western Empire fell in 476. Animal hunts continued until 523, 47 years after Rome itself had ceased to exist as a political entity. The spectacles outlived the civilization that created them. The poet Juvenal saw all of this coming. He was born around 55 AD in the small town of Aquinum, trained as a rhetorician, failed to advance under the Emperor Domitian, and was possibly exiled. He was not wealthy. He was not powerful. He was angry, and in Satire 10, writing around 100 to 130 AD, he coined a phrase that would define this pattern for the next 2,000 years. The Roman people, he wrote, who once held military command, high civil office, legions, everything, now restrain themselves and anxiously hope for just two things: bread and circuses. Panem et circenses. The same satire also gave us another phrase you probably know: mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy mind in a healthy body. Both observations came from the same poem, by a man who was virtually unknown in his own lifetime. Only the poet Martial mentions him in passing, calling him eloquent. He was rediscovered in the 4th century, when the Roman aristocracy began reading him with what the historian Ammianus Marcellinus described as great enthusiasm, by which point every single thing Juvenal had warned about had come to pass. The aristocrats who read him were reading a diagnosis of their own terminal condition and apparently enjoyed the style. I want you to hold that thought. A man who saw the pattern clearly was ignored in real time and celebrated only after it was too late. That specific dynamic, the prophet of decline as posthumous entertainment, is itself part of the pattern. We will come back to it. Now, if Rome were the only case, you could dismiss this as a single data point, one civilization's quirk, an interesting historical coincidence that proves nothing about civilizations in general. That would be a reasonable position to take. But Rome is not the only case. And this is where I need to tell you about tortoises carrying candles through tulip gardens while an empire died. The Ottoman Tulip Period lasted 12 years, 1718 to 1730. That is it, 12 years. And in those 12 years, the Ottoman court produced one of the most extraordinary bursts of cultural output in Islamic history, funded by the accumulated wealth of an empire that was already contracting and had been since the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, when the Ottomans lost roughly 100,000 square miles of European territory for the first time in 3 centuries of expansion. Sultan Ahmed III, who was himself an accomplished calligrapher and poet, writing under the pen name The Lover, and his Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha made a decision after the Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718 formalized yet another round of territorial losses. They decided to stop trying to expand and start throwing parties. The tulip festivals that gave the period its name were designed as spectacles of overwhelming sensory beauty. Over 1,500 tulip varieties were cultivated, each with a poetic name: Light of Paradise, Matchless Pearl, Diamond's Envy. At nighttime festivals along the Golden Horn and in the gardens of the newly built Sadabad Palace, candles were set at every 4th tulip bloom, trimmed to the exact height of the flowers. Hundreds of giant tortoises with candles mounted on their shells wandered through the beds. Thousands of mirrored crystal lamps multiplied the light. Songbirds in gilded cages provided music. Palace confectioners spun edible sugar bowers 18 feet long and erected artificial trees 60 feet tall, made of wax, wire, and jewels. Guests were forbidden to wear clothing that clashed with the flowers. I actually found myself laughing when I first read about the tortoise detail. And then I stopped laughing, because the more I thought about it, the more it felt like something out of a dream you have right before a nightmare. Which is essentially what it was. The poet Nedim, court librarian at Topkapi Palace, became the era's defining voice. Let us laugh, let us play, let us enjoy the delights of the world to the full. The painter Levny produced his masterpiece, The Surname I Vahabi, documenting a 15-day circumcision festival in 137 vividly colored miniatures. And Ibrahim Mutefferika, a Hungarian convert to Islam, established the first Ottoman printing press in December 1727, producing 17 titles in 22 volumes totaling roughly 13,000 books. But the structural contradictions were fatal. Military modernization was neglected. An unpopular war tax funded campaigns against Persia, while the court staged spectacles. On September 28, 1730, an Albanian former bathhouse attendant named Petrona Halil, backed by roughly 12,000 janissaries, launched a revolt. Ahmed III, learning the mob wanted his vizier, had Ibrahim Pasha strangled on October 2nd and his body thrown to the rioters. The Sultan abdicated the same day. Sarabad Palace was torn down in 3 days. The poet Nedim was murdered trying to escape. The poet of pleasure died in the streets while the city burned. 12 years of tortoise-lit tulip gardens ended in 72 hours of violence. And the trajectory from Karlowitz to the Tulip Period to the label Sick Man of Europe, attributed to Tsar Nicholas I in 1853, traces a clear arc of decline punctuated by one brilliant, doomed interlude of entertainment. Now, you might be thinking that the Ottoman case is structurally different from Rome. That Ahmed III was deliberately choosing entertainment over military spending, which is a policy failure, not a civilizational pattern. That is a reasonable objection. So let me tell you about a place where entertainment exploded, not because the government chose it, but because the population demanded it. Where the golden age was not top-down, but bottom-up. Where 500 nightclubs opened in a city with 6 million unemployed. Weimar Berlin, 1919 to 1933. 14 years that produced more culturally significant art per square mile than arguably any other place and time in human history. And every single piece of it was created against a backdrop of hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and political disintegration so severe that the government literally could not maintain order in its own capital. The numbers are almost comically precise in their juxtaposition. In the late 1920s, Berlin hosted an estimated 500 entertainment establishments, cabarets, nightclubs, dance halls, gay and lesbian bars, transvestite venues, nudist clubs. The El Dorado, a famous transvestite bar, was so mainstream that Cook's tours included it on standard tourist itineraries. Josephine Baker made her Berlin debut in 1926 and declared that in no other city had she received so many love letters, so many flowers. Mocha Efti served 25,000 cups of coffee daily and transformed into the city's most popular dance hall at night. The films that emerged from this scene would shape the entire history of cinema. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari premiered on February 26, 1920, with its angular painted sets and atmosphere of paranoid claustrophobia. Fritz Lang's Metropolis in 1927 remains the most expensive silent film ever made. The budget ballooned from 1.5 million to 5.3 million Reichsmarks, roughly 200 million in today's money, with 36,000 extras and 17 months of filming. It nearly destroyed UFA studios. The Threepenny Opera by Brecht and Weil premiered on August 31st, 1928, and achieved 400 performances in 2 years, was translated into 18 languages, and was staged over 10,000 times across Europe by 1933. The Blue Angel in 1930 made Marlene Dietrich an international star. Fritz Lang's M in 1931, with Peter Lorre's performance as a child murderer, remains one of the most influential early sound films ever made. And the economic context makes all of this almost impossible to process. Before World War I, the German mark traded at 4.2 to the dollar. By January 1923, it was 17,000. By July, 353,000. By August, 4.6 million. By November 1923, 4.2 trillion marks to $1. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. The Reichsbank printed 496 quintillion marks before stabilizing the currency with the Rentenmark. Then, the Depression hit. Unemployment climbed from 1.3 million in the summer of 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. 30% of the workforce, industrial production fell to 58% of 1928 levels. Christopher Isherwood, the English writer who lived in Berlin from 1929 to 1933 at Nollendorfstrasse 17, captured the mood with a famous opening line from Goodbye to Berlin. I am a camera with its shutter open, quite passive, recording, not thinking. His landlady's tenant, Jean Ross, a 19-year-old British cabaret singer, became the character Sally Bowles, later immortalized by Liza Minnelli in the 1972 film Cabaret. Isherwood fled Germany on April 5, 1933, 2 weeks after the Enabling Act. And then it was destroyed, with a speed that still shocks me every time I go through the timeline. Hitler became Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. The Reichstag burned February 27th. Gay clubs were shut by late February. On May 6th, 14 weeks after Hitler's appointment, Nazi students accompanied by a brass band raided Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute für Sexualwissenschaft, the world's first institute for sexual research. Founded on July 6, 1919. They spent 3 hours destroying 20,000 books, 35,000 photographs, clinical records, anatomical models. 4 days later, on May 10th, those materials were burned on the open Platz alongside 20,000 other books. Hirschfeld's story deserves a moment because it is one of the most devastating biographical details in this entire subject. He was a physician and sexologist who had founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in 1897, 21 years before the Weimar Republic even existed. His institute was the first in the world to perform gender-affirming surgeries. It housed the largest collection of materials on human sexuality ever assembled. He had survived a beating by nationalist thugs in 1920 that fractured his skull so severely that newspapers printed his obituary. He recovered. He kept working. By 1930, his health was failing and he left Germany for a world lecture tour. He was in France when the Nazis came. He watched the destruction of his institute, his library, his life's work in a Paris cinema newsreel. There is something almost perfectly cruel about that detail. The man who had spent his career studying the full range of human experience was reduced to watching his own erasure as entertainment, flickering on a screen in a darkened room. He died in exile in Nice on May 14, 1935, his 67th birthday. The roses on his coffin came from an anonymous donor. The richest cultural scene in Europe was dismantled in about 4.5 months. 3 civilizations now: Rome, the Ottomans, Weimar. 3 entertainment explosions during structural decline. 3 violent ends. And each one suggests a slightly different answer to the central question of what entertainment is doing inside a dying civilization. In Rome, it looks like state-sponsored pacification. In the Ottoman case, it looks like elite displacement, a ruling class choosing beauty over the military problem it could not solve. In Weimar, it looks like popular escape, millions of people self-medicating with culture because the economic reality was literally unlivable. But that is 3 different answers, which means entertainment is not doing one thing in declining civilizations. It appears to be doing whatever the civilization needs it to do. And that is actually more disturbing than a single explanation, because it means the pattern is not driven by any one cause. It is structural. Something about the way complex societies decline produces entertainment proliferation, the way a fever produces sweating, not as a choice, as a symptom. And we are not done with the evidence. Not even close. F. Scott Fitzgerald called the 1920s the most expensive orgy in history. In his 1931 essay, Echoes of the Jazz Age, he wrote that the decade was an age of miracles. It was an age of art. It was an age of satire. He was not being nostalgic. He was writing an autopsy. The entertainment statistics of 1920s America have a manic quality that becomes unsettling once you know what came next. Weekly movie attendance climbed from roughly 40 million in the early 20s to 90 to 100 million by the decade's end. In a nation of 120 million people. Think about that penetration rate. The number of movie theaters grew from around 15,000 to 22,000. Radio went from essentially 0 household penetration in 1920, when KDKA Pittsburgh began broadcasting on November 2nd, to 10 million households by 1929, with over 1,400 stations on the air and half of American homes equipped with sets by 1930. At the height of Prohibition, an estimated 32,000 speakeasies operated in New York City alone. The Dempsey-Tunney Long Count fight on September 22nd, 1927, drew 104,943 spectators to Soldier Field in Chicago, generating a gate of $2.6 million, around $49 million today. The first $2 million gate in entertainment history, while 50 million Americans listened on 60 NBC radio stations. Total American entertainment spending hit approximately $4 billion in 1929, double the figure from 1919. And beneath all of it, the structure was rotting. Farm prices had collapsed 53% between 1920 and 1921 and never recovered during the decade. 5,000 banks failed in the 1920s, mostly in rural areas. By 1928, the top 1% of families received 23.9% of all pre-tax income. Manufacturing output per person rose 32%, but average wages increased only 8%. An estimated 60% of Americans lived below the poverty line, while the country danced. I spent 3 hours one evening just cross-referencing entertainment spending data with structural economic indicators from the 20s. And what struck me was not that the pattern existed, but how perfectly synchronized it was. The entertainment boom and the structural decay were not happening in parallel. They were moving in precise inverse proportion. As the foundation cracked, the party got louder. The Dow climbed from 63 in August 1921 to 381 on September 3rd, 1929. A six-fold increase in 8 years, fueled by margin buying that required as little as 10% down. Black Thursday, October 24, 12.9 million shares traded. The market lost 11% at the opening bell. Black Tuesday, October 29th, over 16 million shares, $14 billion in value gone in a single day. By July 8th, 1932, the Dow bottomed at 41.22, an 89% decline. It did not return to its pre-crash level until November 23rd, 1954. 25 years later, movie theaters collapsed from 22,000 to 15,000. Weekly attendance fell from 100 million to 65 million. By 1933, 11,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks had failed. Fitzgerald's personal trajectory tracked the national one with an almost literary precision that feels, honestly, like the universe was writing fiction. This side of paradise made him famous overnight at 23. He married Zelda Sayre 1 week after publication. They checked into the Biltmore Hotel in New York and promptly got kicked out for spinning in the revolving door for half an hour. They dove into the fountain at Union Square. They rode on the roofs of taxis. Fitzgerald was earning the equivalent of $100,000 a year in today's money from his short stories alone, and spending more than that. They moved to Great Neck, Long Island, threw lavish parties, lived next door to the bootleggers and socialites who had become the raw material for Gatsby. He published The Great Gatsby in April 1925. It received respectful reviews, but disappointing sales, roughly 12,000 copies. Fitzgerald was devastated. He had written the best novel of the decade, and the public was too busy partying to notice. By the early 30s, everything was falling apart. Zelda suffered her first mental breakdown in 1930 and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. The medical bills were enormous. Fitzgerald's drinking, always heavy, became catastrophic. He was hospitalized for alcoholism 8 times between 1933 and 1937. By 1936, his book royalties had fallen to $80 for the entire year. His 3 novels combined sold a total of 30 copies that year. 30. He wrote 3 confessional essays for Esquire magazine, titled The Crack-Up, published between February and April 1936, in which he dissected his own disintegration with surgical clarity. The opening line was this: "Of course, all life is a process of breaking down." He moved to Hollywood, wrote screenplays, earned decent money, but was treated as a has-been. He worked on a novel about Hollywood called The Last Tycoon that he never finished. He was reportedly drinking 40 beers a day in his final months. He died of a heart attack on December 21st, 1940, at 44 in the Hollywood apartment of his girlfriend, the gossip columnist Schuyler Graham. His books were out of print. His obituary in the New York Times was respectful, but brief. His friend John O'Hara described him as a prematurely old little man, haunting bookstores, unrecognized. 2 years later, 155,000 copies of The Great Gatsby were distributed to American soldiers overseas by the Council on Books in wartime, beginning the resurrection of a novel that is now considered the great American novel. He never lived to see it. He rose with the decade, cracked with the crash, and died in the hangover. His entire life was the pattern, compressed into one human body. Now I want to do something that I think will change how you see this pattern. And it is going to move quickly, because the point is accumulation. Every additional example makes coincidence less tenable. And I want to be clear about what I am doing here. I am not cherry-picking. These are every major civilization for which we have sufficient cultural and economic records to evaluate the claim. I looked for counterexamples, civilizations that collapsed without an entertainment boom. I could not find one that had adequate records to assess. If you can, I genuinely want to hear about it. Late Ming Dynasty China. 1644. In the decades before collapse, Chinese culture produced its greatest literary works. Journey to the West was published around 1592. Jinping Mei, The Golden Lotus, one of the most celebrated novels in Chinese literature, circulated around 1610. Kungfu opera, the most refined theatrical form in Chinese history, dominated the stage. A commercial publishing boom created an entertainment culture in cities like Nanjing and Suzhou that some historians have compared to early modern London. Woodblock printed novels sold in the tens of thousands. The literati class threw elaborate garden parties. Meanwhile, the Wanli emperor stopped attending court for decades, just stopped showing up. The treasury emptied, the military deteriorated. Peasant rebellions spread through the countryside. The Little Ice Age caused famines. On April 24, 1644, the Chongzhen emperor, the last of the Ming, hanged himself on a tree on Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City as Li Zicheng's rebel armies entered Beijing. The Manchus captured the capital within weeks. The commercial entertainment culture and the political disintegration overlapped almost exactly. Spain's Golden Age, the Siglo de Oro, roughly 1580 to 1680. This one is particularly striking because the cultural output was so extraordinary that it defined an entire language's literary canon. And it happened during what was arguably the most catastrophic strategic decline in European history. Cervantes published Don Quixote, Part 1 in 1605, Part 2 in 1615. The novel is widely considered the first modern novel in any language. Velázquez painted Las Meninas in 1656. Lope de Vega, the most prolific playwright who ever lived, claimed to have written 1,500 plays in his lifetime. 637 are known by title. Roughly 450 survive. The chorales de comedias, public courtyard theatres, thrived in Madrid from the 1580s. Spanish theatre was the most popular form of entertainment in Europe, and all of this happened while the Armada was defeated in 1588. The Netherlands were lost. Silver-driven inflation raised prices 400% between 1500 and 1650. The state went bankrupt multiple times. The army was shattered at Rocroi in 1643, and Portugal declared independence in 1640. Spain went from European hegemon to exhausted second-rate power while producing the greatest works in its language. Cervantes himself was wounded at the Battle of Lepanto, spent 5 years as a slave in Algiers, was imprisoned for debt, and wrote his masterpiece while the empire he had fought for fell apart around him. He is another Fitzgerald, the artist as mirror of the pattern. Pre-revolutionary France crystallized the pattern at Versailles, where more than 2,000 rooms housed between 3,000 and 10,000 people daily in a self-contained universe of entertainment and ritual. Marie Antoinette built a personal theatre, the Théâtre de la Reine, completed in 1779, seating 250, where she performed in amateur dramatics, playing milkmaids and peasant girls while the state hurtled toward fiscal collapse. Paris hosted 62 literary salons under Louis XVI, where philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot simultaneously entertained and critiqued the ruling class. The whole arrangement had the quality of a civilization watching itself die and finding the performance aesthetically interesting. On October 1st, 1789, a lavish banquet at the Royal Opera of Versailles, the last grand fete of the monarchy, so enraged the starving populace that it triggered the Women's March on Versailles 4 days later. Edwardian Britain, 1901 to 1914. Country house weekends, the London season. Ascot, Henley, the London Coliseum opening in 1904 as the largest and most luxurious variety theatre in Europe. Garden parties that lasted entire weekends. A servant class so vast that domestic service was the single largest employment category in Britain. Behind it all, Britain's growth rate and manufacturing output had fallen behind both the United States and Germany. A naval arms race was consuming the treasury, and mass urban poverty persisted in conditions that Charles Booth's surveys had documented in shocking detail. The Edwardian afternoon ended on August 4th, 1914. The generation that had attended those house parties was slaughtered in the trenches within 4 years. The Abbasid Caliphate built the magnificent Mustansiriya Madrasa between 1228 and 1233, one of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world. In the decades before Hulagu Khan's Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258 and reportedly turned the Tigris black with ink from the books they threw into the river, the Byzantine Empire experienced the Paleologan Renaissance from 1261 to 1453, producing stunning mosaics at the Chora Church and a revival of classical scholarship, while the empire's territory contracted to essentially Constantinople and a few scattered possessions, its population falling from perhaps 250,000 to just 50,000 by 1453. 8 civilizations spanning 2,500 years, across 3 continents, cultures that had zero contact with one another. Every single one of them produced a golden age of entertainment during structural decline. Every single one. At what point does coincidence stop being a reasonable explanation? The answer is that it stopped being reasonable about a century ago, when several of the most serious thinkers of the 20th century independently identified this pattern and tried to explain it. And what is remarkable is that they all confirmed the pattern exists, but could not agree on why. Oswald Spengler published The Decline of the West in 1918, and his framework is the most dramatic. Civilizations, he argued, are organisms. They have lifespans of roughly 1,000 years. They pass through seasonal stages. Spring is religious awakening. Summer is consolidation. Autumn is intellectual peak. Winter is decline into what he called civilization, which he distinguished from culture. Culture creates, civilization consumes. In the megalopolitan winter phase, Spengler wrote, "The relief of hard, intensive brain work by its opposite, conscious and practiced fooling, the sensual straining after pleasure. All this is common to the world cities of all the civilizations." He saw bread and circuses not as a Roman peculiarity, but as a universal, late-stage symptom. But Arnold Toynbee disagreed with Spengler's determinism. Across 12 volumes and 3 million words of a study of history, published between 1934 and 1961, Toynbee proposed that civilizations rise through the leadership of a creative minority that inspires imitation, and decline when that minority degenerates into a merely dominant minority, maintaining power through force. In Disintegrating Civilizations, he identified vulgarizations of manners, arts, and language that appear first in the proletariat and spread upward. Unlike Spengler, Toynbee insisted civilizations die from suicide, not natural causes. Sir John Glubb is, I think, the most important figure in this entire intellectual tradition, and the most underappreciated. He was not an academic, he was a soldier. Born in 1897, commissioned in the Royal Engineers in April 1915, wounded 3 times in World War I, including a jaw wound that earned him the nickname Abu Hunayak, father of the little jar, among the Bedouin he later lived with. He served in Iraq from 1920, walking away from a comfortable posting to live among desert tribes because he found colonial administration boring. He then commanded the Jordanian Arab Legion from 1939 to 1956, making him a British officer directing Arab troops across the territory of what had been the Ottoman Empire, itself one of the civilizations whose decline he would later study. When he was dismissed under nationalist pressure in 1956, he returned to England and began writing about what he had witnessed. The Fate of Empires, published in 1978, runs to only 26 pages. It is, page for page, possibly the most information-dense historical argument ever written, and almost nobody has read it. Glubb identified 6 stages of empire, culminating in what he called the Age of Decadence, characterized by defensiveness, pessimism, frivolity, celebrity culture, and obsession with entertainment and sport. His most striking empirical claim was that empires last approximately 250 years, roughly 10 generations, regardless of technology or geography. He listed the numbers: Assyria, 247 years, Persia, 208, Greece, 231, the Roman Republic, 233, the Roman Empire, 207, the Arab Empire, 246, the Ottoman Empire, 250, Spain, 250, Britain, 250. The clustering around that 250-year mark is genuinely eerie. He was honest about his limitations. He admitted that he excluded India, China, and Southern America because, as he put it, the writer knows nothing about them. You almost never see that kind of candor in civilizational theory. On entertainment specifically, Glubb was blunt. During the final decades of their own empires, a nation's collective attention becomes consumed by sport and entertainment. He also observed that declining empires made celebrities of their chefs. I want you to sit with that observation for a moment, and then think about the last time you watched a cooking competition on television. Jacques Barzun offers what I consider the most precise definition of what all these thinkers were circling. Barzun was born in France in 1907, came to America at 13, spent decades at Columbia University, and published his masterwork, From Dawn to Decadence, at 93 years old. Then he lived another 12 years, dying at 104. His lifespan meant he personally witnessed the entire arc he described, from pre-World War I European confidence through 2 world wars, the atomic age, television, and the early internet. His definition of decadence is crucial because it strips away the moral judgment. All that is meant by decadence is falling off, he wrote. It is a very active time, full of deep concerns, but peculiarly restless, for it sees no clear lines of advance. The loss it faces is that of possibility. Boredom and fatigue are great historical forces. That last line has stayed with me since I first read it. Boredom and fatigue are great historical forces. Not war, not famine, boredom. Joseph Tainter, in The Collapse of Complex Societies in 1988, approached the problem structurally. Societies solve problems by adding complexity. Each layer of complexity has a cost. Eventually, you hit diminishing marginal returns. Each new layer costs more than the last, while solving less. Entertainment, in Tainter's framework, is not a moral failing. It is overhead, the escalating price of social cohesion in systems that are too complex to hold together through simpler means. The Roman games and the grain dole were not decadence. They were the cost of keeping 1 million people from rioting. And Peter Turchin, the most recent and most quantitative of the group, brought mathematical modeling to the problem through his field of clidynamics, which literally means the science of historical dynamics. His structural demographic theory identifies 3 interacting variables that predict civilizational instability: labor oversupply, which suppresses wages; elite overproduction, meaning too many people competing for too few positions at the top, which creates a class of frustrated would-be elites who destabilize existing institutions; and state fiscal crisis. In 2010, he published a prediction in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, that American social instability would peak in the 2020s. That prediction was published well before the political turbulence that began in 2016. He elaborated in his 2016 book, Ages of Discord, which mapped 2 centuries of American data and showed that every indicator he tracked, wealth inequality, elite overproduction, political polarization, state debt, was converging on a crisis point in the 2020s. Whether you find his framework convincing or not, the fact that a quantitative model built on pre-modern civilizational data correctly predicted the timing of modern American instability is, at minimum, worth taking seriously. While Turchin does not directly address entertainment, the scholar Bruce McConaughey has shown that dysphoric dramatic genres, tragedies, dark comedies, nihilistic narratives intensify precisely when Turchin's social cohesion indicators decline. The connection between quantitative structural data and cultural production is not just theoretical, it is measurable. 6 thinkers, Spengler, Toynbee, Glubb, Barzun, Tainter, Turchin, they disagree on mechanism, on inevitability, on whether decline can be reversed. But they converge on one observation: the pattern is real. Entertainment proliferates during collapse, and no single theory can fully explain why. That should concern you more than any one theory being correct, because it means the phenomenon is robust enough to survive theoretical disagreement. You can reject Spengler's biological determinism, reject Toynbee's creative minority framework, reject Glubb's 250-year cycle, and the raw data remains unchanged. 8 civilizations, 8 entertainment booms, 8 structural collapses, which means the question remains open. And now, I have to take you somewhere you probably already sense this is heading, but have been hoping it would not. The modern entertainment ecosystem is not comparable to anything in the historical record. It dwarfs it by orders of magnitude. And I need to be specific here because vague claims are worthless. The numbers themselves are the argument. The global entertainment and media industry generates approximately $2.9 trillion in annual revenue, projected to reach $3.5 trillion by 2029. To put that in perspective, $3 trillion is larger than the entire GDP of the United Kingdom. We are spending more on entertainment than the 5th largest economy on Earth produces in total. The average American adult consumes between 7 and 9 hours of media per day, with Nielsen reporting 8 hours and 34 minutes for adults 18 and older. That is more time than most people spend sleeping. Compare that to the Roman game day calendar at its peak, 177 days per year, maybe 6 to 8 hours on a game day if you stayed for the whole event. The average American now consumes more entertainment annually than a Roman citizen did even during the 177-day calendar. Every single day, 365 days a year of what Rome only managed for 177. Peak TV hit its apex in 2002 too, with approximately 600 original scripted series produced in a single year, nearly tripling the 210 series produced in 2009. Netflix alone targets a content budget of $17 billion annually, serving over 300 million global subscribers. TikTok users spend an average of 95 minutes per day on the platform, more than double the 27 minutes reported in 2019. The global gaming industry generates $184 billion annually, more than film and music combined, with 3.1 billion gamers worldwide. 3.1 billion. That is roughly 40% of the human species playing video games. The top 6 content companies collectively invested $126 billion in content in 2004 alone. $126 billion to produce things for people to watch. I want to be honest about something here. I genuinely do not know how to feel about these numbers. Part of me recognizes that a lot of this content is extraordinary. The last decade has produced some of the best television, the most innovative games, and the most accessible cultural experiences in human history. The idea that entertainment is inherently bad is not supported by the historical evidence, and it is not the argument I am making. Entertainment existed in every civilization during its rise as well as its decline. The question is not whether entertainment exists, but what happens when its volume, its cost, and its share of collective attention reach a certain threshold relative to structural investment. And that is where the modern numbers become difficult to ignore. Now here is where the common response to all of this gets something importantly wrong, and I want to correct it, because I think this correction actually makes the pattern more disturbing, not less. The popular version of this argument is bread and circuses caused Rome to fall. That is an oversimplification bordering on a myth. Entertainment existed in Rome from the Republic's earliest days. The Ludi Romani date to the 6th century BC. Games were a feature of Roman life during the Republic's expansion, during the Pax Romana, during the height of imperial power. Entertainment did not cause the decline. Entertainment was always there, What changed was the proportion, the ratio of entertainment to civic function, the rate of escalation, the relationship between what a civilization spends on spectacle and what it spends on its own structural maintenance. When game days went from 49 to 177, while the currency went from 95% silver to 2%, that is not entertainment existing. That is entertainment metastasizing. And that distinction is critical because it means you cannot simply point at entertainment and say that is the problem. The problem is what happens when entertainment begins to consume the attention and resources that a civilization needs to maintain itself. And the structural indicators in the modern case are not vaguely parallel to historical precedents. They are numerically parallel. US national debt stands at approximately $38.9 trillion, with interest payments reaching roughly $970 billion in fiscal year 2025, surpassing defense spending for the first time in modern history. The American Society of Civil Engineers rates national infrastructure at an overall grade of C, with an investment gap of $3.7 trillion. The Gini coefficient hit 0.494 in 2001, the highest in 50 years and the highest among G7 nations. The top 1% of American families received 23.9% of all pre-tax income in 1928. The current figure is comparable. US life expectancy at 78.4 years is the lowest among large wealthy nations, 4.1 years below the peer country average of 82.5, despite spending 18% of GDP on healthcare, the highest in the world. I am not making an argument that collapse is imminent. That would be irresponsible, and it would also be historically illiterate, because the timelines vary enormously across the cases we have examined. Rome's entertainment escalation lasted centuries. Weimar's lasted 14 years. The Tulip Period was 12. There is no fixed countdown, and there are genuine counter-arguments that deserve acknowledgement. Entertainment spending as a percentage of household budget has remained relatively stable at around 4.5% to 5.5% for 90 years, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, though that figure excludes most digital consumption, which, if included, would push the real share considerably higher. Infrastructure grades are technically improving from their 1990s nadir. Democratic institutions, while stressed, have not collapsed. The economist Brett Devereaux has argued persuasively that the popular narrative of bread and circuses causing Rome's fall is a crude oversimplification that smashes together complaints about luxury spanning 700 years of Roman history. These counter-arguments are real, and they matter. But they do not address the central finding. They address the simplistic version of the argument, the version that says entertainment is bad and that is why civilizations fall. That is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is something more subtle and more troubling. What it shows is that civilizations in structural decline do not go quiet. They go loud. They redirect energy from maintenance to distraction, not because anyone decides to, but because the incentive structure shifts. When the problems become too large and too systemic for any individual or institution to solve, the rational response at every level of society, from emperor to citizen, from studio executive to viewer, is to do exactly what feels good in the short term. Watch the games, attend the festival, open another streaming tab, scroll for another hour. The entertainment is not imposed, it is chosen. That is what makes the pattern so resilient across cultures. Nobody decrees it from above. It emerges naturally from the interaction between declining structural conditions and the universal human preference for pleasure over anxiety. And the structural indicators in the modern case are not vaguely parallel to historical precedents. They are numerically parallel. US national debt stands at approximately $38.9 trillion, with interest payments reaching roughly $970 billion in fiscal year 2000-2005, surpassing defense spending for the first time in modern history. The American Society of Civil Engineers rates national infrastructure at an overall grade of C, with an investment gap of $3.7 trillion. The Gini coefficient hit 0.494 in 2001, the highest in 50 years and the highest among G7 nations. The top 1% of American families received 23.9% of all pre-tax income in 1928. The current figure is comparable. US life expectancy at 78.4 years is the lowest among large, wealthy nations, 4.1 years below the peer country average of 82.5, despite spending 18% of GDP on healthcare, the highest in the world. But here is what keeps me up at night about this, and I do not say that as a rhetorical device. I mean it literally. Every previous civilization that exhibited this combination of entertainment saturation and structural deterioration believed it was thriving. The Roman senatorial class attended the games. They did not think they were watching the symptoms of collapse. They thought they were participating in Roman culture. The Ottoman court attended the tulip festivals. They thought they were patrons of civilization. Weimar's intelligentsia attended the cabarets and the film premieres. They thought they were living through a cultural renaissance. The Americans of 1928 attended the speakeasies and the boxing matches, and the picture shows they thought they were living in the most prosperous nation on earth. And they were right. In the same way that someone running a fever of 103 can accurately report that they feel warm. The warmth is real. It is also a symptom. The entertainment is always real. The art is often genuinely great. Some of the finest work in the history of every civilization on this list was produced during the period we are discussing. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote during Spain's terminal decline. Fritz Lang made Metropolis during Weimar's. Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby during the 20s. The quality of the entertainment is not in question. What is in question is what it means when a civilization's cultural output reaches its apex at the same moment its structural foundations are giving way. And that is the pattern's most dangerous property. It is invisible from inside, because the entertainment is good, because the content is genuinely compelling, because the 8.5 hours feel like choice, not compulsion, because the screens are small and personal and held in the hand, not enormous and public and ringed with 50,000 spectators. The modern version of the pattern does not look like the Colosseum. It looks like Tuesday evening. It looks like the hours between dinner and sleep. It looks like a thumb moving across glass. Isherwood wrote, "I am a camera with its shutter open, quite passive, recording, not thinking." He was describing himself, a young writer observing Weimar Berlin from the inside. But he was also describing something universal about how people relate to spectacle during collapse. They watch, they do not act. They record, they do not think. The camera metaphor is precise because a camera has no agency. It receives. It does not decide. And there are now more cameras in this sense than at any point in human history. Billions of them, scrolling, consuming, recording, not thinking. Juvenal diagnosed this 19 centuries ago and was ignored. Fitzgerald diagnosed it in the 20s and was consumed by the very thing he described. He rose with the decade, cracked with the crash, and died in the hangover. His books out of print, his liver destroyed, his greatest novel waiting for a war to make it famous. Glubb diagnosed it from the wreckage of the Ottoman and British empires and published his findings in a 26-page essay that almost nobody read. Barzun diagnosed it over 877 pages at the age of 93 and then watched from a quiet house in San Antonio, Texas, as the pattern he described continued for another 12 years until his death at 104. His final assessment was careful. Decadence, he wrote, is the normal close of great periods and the necessary condition of the creative novelty that will burst forth tomorrow or the next day. That is either the most hopeful or the most terrifying sentence in the history of civilizational theory, and I have been unable to decide which. The pattern does not require your belief. It does not require anyone's belief. It is not a theory about what might happen. It is a description of what has already happened 8 times across 2,500 years, documented with specific dates, specific spending figures, specific game day counts, specific currency debasement timelines, specific unemployment rates, and specific collapse dates. The only question the data cannot answer is whether this time is different. Every previous civilization inside the pattern believed it was different. That belief is, itself, part of the pattern. And you are hearing this right now on a device that is, statistically, also the device on which you spent several of today's 8.5 hours of media consumption. Inside a civilization that is running a $3.7 trillion infrastructure deficit while spending $3 trillion a year on entertainment. Inside an economy where the interest payments on the national debt have surpassed military spending. Inside a culture that produces 600 scripted television series per year, more narrative content than any human could consume in a lifetime, while its bridges earn a grade of C. Inside a species that has figured out how to put a screen in every pocket and a story on every screen and a monetization model behind every story, and that has done all of this so efficiently that 40% of the planet now spends part of every day inside a digital entertainment environment that did not exist 20 years ago. Fitzgerald once wrote that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Here are your 2 ideas. This pattern has repeated 8 times, and every previous civilization inside it believed it was the exception. And you are, right now, doing the thing the pattern describes. You are consuming entertainment, about the dangers of entertainment, on a device designed to keep you consuming. I do not know what that means. Barzun did not know what it meant, and he had 104 years to think about it. Glubb did not know, and he watched empires fall from horseback. Spengler did not know, and he saw his own civilization collapse around him in real time. What I know is that the data exists, that the pattern is documented, that the scholars who studied it are not fringe, and that the average person living inside a civilization matching this description has never once been presented with the comparative data in a way that would allow them to evaluate the pattern for themselves. You have it now, and Juvenal is still waiting. He has been waiting for 1900 years. Every generation that rediscovered him thought they would be the ones to listen. The Roman aristocrats of the 4th century read him with enthusiasm, while the game days climbed to 177. The Enlightenment philosophers quoted him while Versailles staged its final banquet. Modern commentators cite Panem et Circenses in op-eds that are published between advertisements for streaming services and then forgotten by the next news cycle. The entertainment was always more interesting than the warning. That was the whole point of the warning. And right now, somewhere, the next video in your feed is already loading.